When I finally opened my eyes after 3.5 months in a hospital bed, the first thing I saw wasn't Carol. It was a nurse adjusting the drip beside me. I croaked her name. The nurse blinked. "Carol?" she repeated. "She hasn't. Visited once." I thought she was joking. Carol, my girlfriend of 4 years, was the one who held my hand when I went into surgery. She cried on my chest the night before the accident. She said she'd wait. I couldn't feel my legs yet, but the hole tearing through my chest felt worse. The nurse said my accident had made the news. The car flipped 3 times on the expressway. She said they'd sent my phone and wallet to my emergency contact, Carol. But no one answered after that. No one came, not once. When the doctor returned with my release form a week later, I asked if anyone had signed on my behalf for decisions. He checked the file and said, "Yeah, a Daniel Foster visited early on. Said he was your cousin." Daniel. That name didn't sit right. He wasn't family. He was our couple's therapist. I was still weak when I took a cab back home. I hadn't been back to our apartment in over 100 days. The elevator mirror showed someone thinner, ghost-like, but my mind was sharp. The key still worked. I stepped inside and heard laughter from the living room. Carol's laugh. She was there, legs folded on the couch, wearing a robe I bought her for Valentine's last year, feet in Daniel's lap, a glass of red wine in her hand. She looked up and froze. Daniel turned. Blanched, my cane clattered to the floor. Carol didn't move. Didn't even look surprised, just tired. She took a sip of her wine. "Richard," she said flatly, "I thought you were dead." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I stared at the therapist who had once asked me to trust the healing process. He didn't even blink, just stood slowly and said, "Maybe you should sit down." I met Carol 4 years ago at a mutual friend's engagement party. She wasn't the loudest in the room, but she didn't need to be. There was something magnetic about her calm. She sipped her drink slowly, laughed with her eyes first, and when she looked at me, I felt like I'd already known her in another life. Carol was a junior interior designer then. She had just moved into the city after quitting a suffocating job at a firm that stole her creativity. I was working in logistics, managing import routes and supplier delays. My world was routine, tight, predictable. She was everything outside of that, messy, spontaneous, a little chaotic, but somehow it worked. The first year was soft. We painted our first place together in warm beige tones, even though she liked cooler shades. We fought over plants in the kitchen and kissed during arguments. When I fell sick, she stayed up the whole night holding a cold cloth to my forehead. When her landlord raised the rent suddenly, I paid the difference without blinking. She told me I made her feel safe. She said she'd never had that before. The second year was harder. She lost her job, started working freelance. The instability frustrated her. I came home from work to see dishes in the sink, bills on the table, her curled on the couch staring at nothing. I offered help. She called it control. We yelled more, made up more. But the gap started forming. Year 3 was when we started therapy. Daniel was our therapist. A calm, polished man in his early 40s who always smelled like pine soap and mint tea. He asked the right questions. He never took sides. Carol opened up in sessions in ways she never did at home. She cried about feeling caged, about how love was always a currency for her in past relationships. I listened, sometimes defensively, sometimes quietly. Daniel told us healing wasn't linear, that some couples burn through each other before learning how to breathe together. There were days I thought therapy saved us. Then there were days Carol came home from sessions distant, like her mind stayed behind in his office. I asked once if she thought he liked her. She scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous, Richard. That's literally the most inappropriate thing you could say." I let it go. Year 4, I got into the accident. It was raining, I'd stayed late helping a friend move, and I tried to overtake on a narrow bend. The next thing I remember was darkness, hospital lights, and a nurse telling me they'd had to induce a coma to reduce swelling in my brain. Carol was listed as my emergency contact, my only one, really. I had no siblings. My father passed away when I was 10, and my mother and I had fallen out years ago. I had no one else. In the beginning, the nurses said she came by once, signed a form, then never returned. I didn't believe them at first. I told myself she must have thought I was going to die, that maybe it was too hard to see me in that state. But when I saw her again, with Daniel's hand resting lazily on her knee, there were no questions left to ask. They didn't scramble to explain. They didn't apologize. Carol didn't even look ashamed. "You weren't waking up," she said simply. And Daniel helped me process it. Process it, like my coma was a breakup, like she'd buried me while I was still breathing. I didn't scream, didn't cry. I just stood there, the hospital ID still hanging from my neck, the cane trembling in my hand. Daniel looked at me like I was a client late for a session. "Richard," he said, "you've been through trauma. Let's not escalate things unnecessarily." I turned to Carol. "Is this real?" She looked down at her glass and nodded. "I'm sorry, I didn't know how to explain it. At first it was just talking. But then you weren't coming back and you blocked me," I said. "On everything." She didn't deny it. "I had to move on, Richard. I didn't think they said even if you woke up, you might not be the same. And what about my things? The apartment? I moved everything. Sold some. We live here now. This was our home. My books, my shelves, my favorite mug, gone. Our anniversary picture on the hallway wall had been replaced with abstract art I knew Daniel liked. He used to talk about it in therapy. I remembered him calling realism predictable. I stared at them. The betrayal didn't feel fiery. It was cold, like stepping into a home that looked like yours, but knowing every inch had been repainted without you. Daniel stood. "Maybe you should call someone, a friend. A ride back to the hospital, maybe?" Carol finally looked up at me. "Do you have somewhere to go?" I laughed once, softly. "Do you care?" She didn't answer. I picked up my cane, walked out of my own apartment, past my own doormat, out into a world I hadn't seen in over 3 months, completely alone. I spent that night on a bench near the river, just a few blocks from the hospital that had become my prison. The cold seeped into my bones, but I barely felt it. My mind was still stuck in that living room. Carol's robe, Daniel's hand, the way she sipped her wine like I was an inconvenience. Like my return had disrupted her peace. At sunrise, I used the hospital's public computer to check my accounts. My savings were mostly intact, but the shared savings account we opened together 2 years ago cleared out, every last cent. Her name was on it too. I didn't even need to check the transaction history. I knew who had drained it. I shuffled into the hospital cafeteria, clutching a paper cup of black coffee I could barely hold. My hand still trembled from nerve damage. My spine was aching. The doctors had warned me I'd never walk normally again. But they didn't prepare me for this. The slow, sickening realization that while my body was fighting to heal, the person I loved had erased me. That afternoon, a message finally came through. "Carol, you weren't supposed to see it that way. You should have called first." No apology, just control. She wanted to manage how I saw the betrayal. I didn't reply. The next day, I checked into a motel using what little cash I had left in my wallet. The room smelled like bleach and regret, but it had a lock, and for now, that was enough. I turned on the TV just for background noise and tried to sleep, but the silence between my ears was too loud. A week passed before Inez called. She'd been a friend from work, smart, quiet, observant. She was the kind of person who noticed if your smile didn't reach your eyes even if no one else did. She had taken time off for family reasons and had just returned when she saw the email about my accident. "Richard?" she said hesitantly. "They said you were in a coma. I only just heard. Are you okay? Where are you?" My throat tightened. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear someone say my name without contempt. We met the next morning at a diner near her apartment. Inez brought a scarf for me, said I looked like a skeleton with bruises. Her eyes watered when she saw me, but she didn't cry. I went to your place, she said over pancakes. Carol told me you'd passed away. I froze. She told your friends I died? She nodded. Said it was sudden. She didn't give details. I even brought flowers to the building and left a note at the door. Inez pulled out her phone and showed me the photo. A small bouquet wilted now on the doorstep of what used to be my home. Daniel answered the door. Said he'd pass the message along. My chest tightened. They didn't tell you I was alive? No. Carol had rewritten history, turned my recovery into a grave. She had mourned me socially and moved on romantically, all before I could even blink again. I wanted to scream, but Inez just reached across the table and held my hand. You don't have to go back there, she said quietly. You're not alone. I shook my head. It's not just betrayal. It's theft, deception, gaslighting. He was our therapist. She was supposed to be my person. I don't even know what part of our relationship was real anymore. Inez let out a breath. That's the worst part, isn't it? You can forgive a moment of weakness, but not a plan, and this was a plan. The betrayal wasn't just that Carol had moved on. It was that she'd done it with precision. She used Daniel, the one person who knew every crack in our relationship, to justify her choices. She blocked my number while using my name to gain access to our accounts. She sold my furniture, slept in our bed, laughed on our couch, and told the world I was gone. It wasn't grief. It was liberation, and now she wanted me to be polite about it. Another message from Carol came that evening. I just want to talk. It wasn't how it looked. I didn't answer. 2 days later, I got an email from Daniel. If you're willing to meet, I think we should have a mature conversation. For closure. He had the audacity to suggest closure. After using his position as a therapist to manipulate my partner, after watching me flatline and deciding it was a convenient time. To replace me, I hit reply, then paused. Closure didn't come from conversations. It came from understanding exactly what had happened and deciding it would never happen again. I wrote one line. Let's meet. My terms. I forwarded the message to Inez. She responded instantly. I'll be there. You're not doing this alone. Richard sat in the diner long after Inez left, her scarf still clutched in his lap, untouched coffee gone cold beside his hand. The low murmur of surrounding tables faded into nothing. His fingers trembled, not from the nerve damage this time, but from something deeper. He hadn't cried once since waking up in that hospital bed. But now, sitting in a booth that smelled faintly of syrup and lemon cleaner, something inside him cracked. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet, internal shattering. How do you mourn someone who's still alive? How do you grieve a home that still exists, but no longer lets you in? Carol didn't just leave. She severed him from everything. She erased him. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was how clean it all was. Calculated. Cold. She hadn't ghosted him. She had outlived him. While he laid unconscious, she'd planned a future without him. And not with a stranger, not even with an old flame, but with the man who'd sat 3 feet away during their therapy sessions, nodding while Richard poured out his fears. The shame hit next, heavy and sharp. How many times had Daniel reassured him? How many times had he turned to Carol after a session and said, I think he's helping us? Richard felt like a fool. He thought about every time he defended her, when she yelled at waiters and he'd smoothed it over, when she cried over losing clients and he'd drained his account to cover her rent. He remembered the soft mornings. How she'd hum off key while brushing her hair, the way she once insisted they learn to cook something new every Sunday. He thought that meant something. He thought they were building a life. But now, it felt like all of that had been performance. She didn't grieve. She replaced. Each new memory twisted inside him like a knife. And yet, Worse than the anger, worse than the humiliation, was the guilt. What if I had been more patient? What if I'd seen the signs? What if I never got in that car? His breath came shallow. The lights of the diner swam in front of him. He clenched his jaw until it hurt. He couldn't go back. He couldn't just move on. Because Carol hadn't just broken his heart, she'd shattered his sense of trust. Even now, part of him still wanted her to call again, to say it was all a misunderstanding, that Daniel had manipulated her, that she missed him. But would he even believe her? Would he even want her back? That's what terrified him, that his body would still ache for someone who left him to rot in a hospital bed. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he imagined waking up in that hospital again, hearing the same nurse say, "She hasn't visited once." He hadn't believed it then, but he did now. The next morning, he stood in front of a mirror and stared. His cheeks were sunken, his ribs visible through his shirt. A scar traced along his right temple. But what unsettled him most was the emptiness in his own eyes. This wasn't just a breakup. This was a dismantling. And the worst part? He didn't know who he was anymore without her. He wasn't angry enough to scream, not broken enough to cry. Just stuck somewhere in the middle, numb, awake, watching his life burn while everyone else carried on like he never existed. Then came the message from Daniel. "Let's meet in a neutral space. I know emotions are high, but we both deserve clarity, neutral." Like he hadn't moved into Richard's life like a parasite, like he hadn't used a clipboard and degrees to excuse what he'd done. Richard stared at the message for 10 full minutes. Then, slowly, deliberately, he typed a reply. "Fine. Tomorrow, noon. The same office you used to hear everything I told you in confidence. Let's see how honest you can be in the same chair." He hit send, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. Just barely. But it was real. Because tomorrow, he wouldn't walk into that office as a broken man. He'd walk in knowing the truth, and he wouldn't walk out without answers. Richard arrived at Daniel's office 10 minutes early. The waiting room hadn't changed. Same bland beige walls, same framed quotes about growth through struggle. He used to find those comforting. Now they felt like mockery. When the receptionist looked up and smiled politely, he didn't return it. "I have a noon with Daniel Foster," she nodded. "He's expecting you." He sat down, his cane resting against the chair. The seconds crawled. Every sound grated. The ticking clock, the flipping of a magazine, the buzz of fluorescent lights. At exactly 12:00, the door to Daniel's office creaked open. Daniel stepped out, face calm as ever, voice smooth. "Richard, come in." Richard stood and walked in without a word. The office looked exactly as he remembered it. Soft lighting, 2 armchairs, a tissue box on a side table like this was just another normal session. But this time, Richard didn't sit in the client's chair. He sat where Carol used to sit. Daniel noticed, said nothing. "I didn't come here to listen," Richard said quietly. "I came to hear the truth." Daniel gave a slow nod. "You deserve that." Richard folded his hands. "So, when did it start?" There was a pause. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "About 6 weeks after your accident." Richard stared. "You mean 6 weeks after I nearly died?" "I didn't plan it," Daniel said carefully. "Carol reached out for support. She was grieving, scared, lost." Richard scoffed. "And you comforted her with wine and sex. Very therapeutic." Daniel's jaw tightened. "We didn't cross that line until much later." "Define much later." Daniel looked away. "Maybe a month." Richard laughed once, bitterly. "So, while I was unconscious, you were building a life with the woman who was supposed to be holding my hand." "She thought you weren't coming back," Daniel said. "She was told your prognosis was uncertain." "I don't care." Richard's voice dropped. "You were our therapist. You knew things no one else did. You heard every insecurity, every fear, and you used them. Daniel opened his mouth, then stopped. That was the moment Richard realized something. Daniel didn't look smug anymore. He looked nervous, and suddenly, it hit. You didn't just let this happen, Richard said. You steered it. Daniel blinked. What are you talking about? The sessions. You knew what to say, what not to say. You made me the problem. Always gently, always just enough to nudge Carol toward feeling like she needed something else. Something you. Daniel's silence was all the confirmation he needed. You planted the seeds. Didn't you? Daniel finally spoke, voice low. Carol was already falling out of love with you, Richard. I didn't force her into anything. But you caught her when she was falling, and you made sure I wasn't there to catch her first. Daniel looked up. Do you want me to apologize? No, Richard said coldly. I want you to know I'm filing a complaint with the board. You broke confidentiality. You breached every ethical boundary in your profession. Daniel didn't flinch. There's no proof. Richard reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a voice recorder. You just gave me enough. Daniel stood suddenly. That's illegal. Richard smiled. So was what you did. But unlike you, I don't need this to ruin you, because I'm not doing it alone. There was a knock at the door. Daniel turned. It opened slowly, and in walked Inez. She gave Daniel a cold look. I've already spoken with the ethics committee, and I've been in touch with a journalist from the Observer. They're very interested in therapists who sleep with unconscious patients' partners. Daniel's face drained of color. Inez walked to Richard's side and sat. Calm, composed, lethal. Richard leaned forward. Here's the twist you didn't expect, Daniel. He tapped the recorder once, then stood. You helped destroy my relationship, but you also helped me find the truth. And this time, you're the one who won't walk away clean. Carol was already waiting when Richard arrived at the cafe. She picked the same seat she always used to, by the window, legs crossed, sunglasses in place like she was guarding herself from the world. Or hiding from it. She looked thinner, not frail but worn. Makeup heavy under the eyes, hair pulled back with a little less care. But when she saw Richard approaching, she didn't stand, didn't smile. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. They hadn't spoken face to face since that day he walked into the apartment and saw her curled into Daniel's side. She looked him over with unreadable eyes. So, this is the closure talk? I guess it is, Richard said evenly. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Carol sighed and placed her phone face down on the table. You've been busy? He didn't respond. She leaned forward slightly. Daniel says you recorded him. Richard raised an eyebrow. He broke every ethical code that exists. Of course I recorded him. Carol frowned. He helped me through the worst period of my life. No, Carol. He took advantage of you. During the worst period of my life, Richard corrected. There's a difference. Her voice hardened. You weren't there. I was in a coma. You left me alone. He leaned back, stunned by the accusation. You don't get to rewrite that. I didn't walk out. I nearly died. You walked away. Carol's lips parted, but no defense came. You told Inez I was dead. Carol flinched. I never used those words. You let people believe it. She looked away. Richard swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady. You cleared out the shared account. You blocked my number. You told the landlord I wouldn't be coming back. You don't know what I went through, she whispered. I don't, he admitted. And I won't pretend this was easy on you. But I woke up expecting the woman I loved to be there. And you weren't just gone. You'd replaced me. Her expression cracked. It wasn't like that. He leaned forward, eyes cold. You mourned me before the doctors had a chance to say I wouldn't wake up. You weren't grieving, Carol. You were relieved. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. You think I'm a monster? I think, Richard said carefully, that you're not the person I thought I knew. And that hurts more than anything else. She reached across the table impulsively, hand trembling. Do you still love me? Richard stared at her hand, then at her face. I don't know what I loved anymore. That answer made her finally pull her hand back. So that's it? You're going to ruin Daniel, ruin me, and move on? I'm not ruining you, Richard said. I'm holding you accountable. There's a difference. Her voice broke. I made a mistake. I was lost. No, he said calmly. You made a choice. And then you doubled down on it. Over and over. Carol slumped slightly. Do you know why I went to Daniel in the first place? Richard said nothing. Because I couldn't talk to you, she whispered. You were always so calm, so measured. I felt like I was screaming underwater. I thought I was being supportive, he said softly. I know, she admitted. But sometimes I needed fire, not stone. And so you went to someone who was paid to listen, Richard said, bitterness creeping in. And when he started telling you what you wanted to hear, you mistook it for love. Carol didn't deny it. He stood. You know what the worst part is? I might have forgiven you if you'd admitted it, if you'd apologized when I walked in that day. But you didn't. You looked at me like I was the one who owed you an explanation. Tears finally broke down her face. Because I panicked. You were supposed to be dead. He stared at her. That's the difference between us, Carol. I never needed you to be perfect. Just honest. She wiped her cheeks, voice cracking. So, what now? You face the consequences, he said quietly. Daniel's already been suspended. The ethics board will review everything. There's a pending case. Inez and I gave them the file. Carol shook her head slowly. You've teamed up with her now? Richard's eyes narrowed. You mean the only person who came to see me after the coma? The one who remembered I was alive? Carol flinched. I don't know what's going to happen between me and Inez, Richard added. Maybe nothing. But at least I know she's not the type to pretend someone died just to avoid guilt. Carol stood. I made a mistake. You made many. I did love you, Richard. I believe you, he said. But it wasn't enough. She stared at him, tears clinging to her lashes. Will you ever forgive me? Richard paused. Then slowly, he shook his head. No. That single word left Carol breathless, like she hadn't expected the final door to close. He turned and walked out of the cafe. Outside, the air was brisk and clean. He took a long breath, the cane now steady in his hand. His legs ached, his heart too. But for the first time since waking up, the weight on his chest had lessened. He kept walking, one slow, measured step at a time. Richard stepped onto the sidewalk, with no real direction in mind, but his chest finally rose without that familiar ache. The air felt lighter, not because the pain had vanished, but because the truth had been spoken and he hadn't flinched. He'd always believed closure was a myth, that no word, no meeting, no confrontation could truly untangle betrayal. But maybe closure wasn't about forgetting the pain. Maybe it was about watching the person who hurt you realize they couldn't twist it anymore. He walked to the park across from the courthouse, the one he and Carol used to visit on Sundays. He sat on the same bench they once carved their initials into, back when love felt permanent. Now, those carved letters were almost faded. He reached into his pocket and ran a thumb over a folded document. The judge's ruling. He'd won. The court had reviewed the case, bank statements, voice recordings, Carol's absence, and Daniel's misconduct. The bride price Carol had used, as her own had been ordered, returned in full, along with damages. Daniel's therapy license was suspended pending further investigation. His practice had already taken a nosedive. Clients were leaving. The whispers were spreading. The story had reached a few online forums. It wouldn't be long before the damage was public. But Richard wasn't finished. He had one more step. That evening, he made a phone call. Hello? The woman answered, cautious. Mrs. Foster? Richard said. Yes? This is Richard, the former client of your husband. There was a long pause. Then, very calmly, she said, I know. Richard didn't need to explain. The news had reached her. He told me it was nothing, she said bitterly. He told me it was clinical. Support. I should have known. He started locking his phone, hiding appointments, saying he had late sessions. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. No, she said. I'm glad I know now. I'm taking my son and moving out by the weekend. Thank you, Richard. He didn't feel triumphant, just resolved. The next morning, he met with Inez again. She brought 2 coffees and a brown envelope. What's this? He asked. Her uncle, Inez said with a small smile. The one Carol kicked out of the family group chat. He sent this. Inside were screenshots, chat logs, voice notes, recordings from when Carol had vented to her relatives about how easy it was to manipulate Richard, and how Daniel helped me find a way to take what I deserved. Inez looked at him. Want to leak it? He didn't answer immediately. Then he slid the envelope back across the table. No, I don't need the world to hate her. That's her own burden to carry. You're sure? He nodded. I already won where it matters. Still, Inez grinned. But I sent it to the ethics board anonymously anyway, just for good measure. Richard chuckled. Remind me never to get on your bad side. She sipped her coffee. You'd never be that. Stupid. They sat quietly for a while, people passing by outside the window. Finally, Richard spoke. You know what's strange? What? I don't miss her anymore. Inez gave him a curious look. After 4 years? He nodded. I grieved her before I even woke up. I just didn't know it. Then he leaned forward slightly, something soft in his voice. What I do miss is peace. And with you, I've felt that. Inez looked down at her cup, then back at him. You're still healing. I know. Then let's heal slowly, she said. Together, no expectations. He smiled. Deal. Weeks passed. Richard got stronger. He started physiotherapy again, this time with Inez sometimes sitting by the window, reading a book while he pushed through the pain. She never pitied him. That's what he admired most. One day, he walked 3 full blocks without the cane. On the way back, he tossed it in a donation bin without looking back. Carol tried calling again. Once. He didn't answer. Daniel tried sending an apology letter. Richard shredded it unopened. Revenge wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Real revenge. Was waking up every morning no longer carrying the weight of someone else's lies. It was healing in plain sight while they withered in their own mess. It was smiling at peace while they scrambled to salvage their reputation. It was walking past the apartment they stole and feeling nothing. It was living well. 6 months later, Richard stood in a new apartment, smaller, cleaner, filled with warm light and none of the ghosts. Inez helped pick the curtains. His mother visited sometimes, proud of how he handled it all. Even his old co-workers, who once sent half-hearted texts, now reached out to reconnect. They'd heard the full story. Everyone had. He never had to say a word. The truth traveled on, its own. One afternoon, while unpacking a new bookshelf, Richard came across an old photo. He and Carol, laughing on a beach, arms wrapped around each other. He stared at it for a long time. Then he threw it away. There was no hate left, just freedom. That night, he and Inez sat on the balcony watching the sky burn orange. You ever think about the what-ifs? She asked softly. He shook his head. No. The past doesn't deserve that much room. She leaned on his shoulder. He didn't flinch. He didn't brace. He just breathed. Ending, because the ultimate revenge isn't screaming at the person who destroyed you. It's outgrowing the person who thought you couldn't survive without them. It's healing so quietly they never hear the sound of your peace until it echoes louder than all their noise. and by then it's too late for them to turn back.